Well, welcome to the Renewed Church podcast, where we have honest and authentic conversations surrounding Jesus and his mission. This is going to be part 2 of our companion podcast to our YOUnity series that we're doing as a church together. And in this podcast, what we're going to do is we're actually going to take a little bit of time firing off a bunch of principles for YOUnity. And the guide that we're going to be using today is actually this book right here, The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. Now, you might be thinking, is this a marriage podcast? Is this about unity in marriage? Well, yes, it can be, but it's not exclusively for that. In my studying on marriage just recently, trying to just figure out how to be a better married person, I came across some of these tips in a chapter in this book that the chapter is titled Turning Towards One Another. And so as I was reading through, I was thinking, not only is this totally helpful and necessary for me and my marriage to be better, but also these are universal principles that can be applied to unity with anybody, turning toward somebody else and growing in unity together, which is what our series is all about. Our series is all about you taking responsibility for unity, because unity starts with you. And in this week's message, we talked about humility and initiation. And so in this week's podcast, I just want to fire off a bunch of pro tips. Now, I hope that you've heard many of these things before, but just like reading this book, I've heard these things before, but I needed to be reminded of them. I hope that this podcast is a chance for you to be reminded of things that you already know and give you a chance to recommit to the principles and ways to live that you know will actually produce unity in your life. So let's jump in and get started. We're going to do one set of 8, and then we're going to do a second set of 8 principles, 16 total. So they're going to be quick, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So here we go. Principle number 1, in turning towards one another, take turns complaining. Take turns. Each party gets a chance to complain. The reality is, if you have a lot of complaint on your mind, somebody else, especially a person you're talking to who might be on the other side of a fence, has stuff to complain about. And so take turns. You guys need to have equal turns complaining. Take turns in your complaining and do it freely. The second thing, show genuine interest. Showing genuine interest looks like actually wanting to know more about the thing that the person is saying. So number 2, show genuine interest. 3, don't jump to unsolicited advice. Don't you hate it when you're just trying to share something with somebody and all they can do is offer you advice or a tip or here's the way I see it, and you're like, no, I don't want any of that. I just need you to hear me. I need you to listen. I don't need your tips. I already know those things. Just hear me out and understand me. Don't offer unsolicited advice. That was number 3. Number 4 is communicate what you understand. Sometimes I struggle with doing this with other people. I assume that I understand, and so I just carry on as though I understand, but I don't communicate back to them that I understand. And what that does is it does 2 effects. 1, it gives them confidence in you actually understanding if you're able to communicate back to them in your own words your understanding, and allows your relationship to move forward. Or 2, gives them an opportunity to actually correct you, to change the way you're thinking about it. They might be able to say, you don't fully understand. And so communicate what you understand so that you can learn what you might not understand, or you can both have confidence that you're on the same page. That was number 4. Number 5, take the other party's side. Take their side. You can take their side even if it's against you. You can offer them that or consider what that could look like for you. But try your best to take their side. Number 6, express a we against other attitudes. I can tell you this, that sometimes my wife, we're fighting constantly and we're like battling each other and it's a war between the two of us. But when there's a conflict, when one of us is involved with somebody else, we are on one another's side. And sometimes that is like the closest we feel to one another, is when we're on the same side fighting another enemy. And I know you probably know this is true in your own relationships. And so consider a we against others attitude, we against the world, that you're on a team and that you're working together to fight a bigger battle that's outside of you, not just seeing one another as enemies. So that's number 6. Number 7, show affection verbally and physically. Now, obviously, physical affection in the context of a marriage would look differently than physical affection in the context of a friendship. But the concept or the the idea of showing affection verbally and physically is one that's useful outside of marriage too, in all relationships. Everybody needs a hug once in a while. Now, obviously with COVID, can't do that. But the truth is that you can show affection by putting your hand on somebody's shoulder and communicating love and care and concern for them. And that goes a long way in producing unity in your relationship. So number 7, show affection verbally and physically. Number 8, validate emotions. I struggle with this, guys, because I have a hard time thinking that emotions matter more than opinions, but they do. I'm an opinion guy. I'm a think guy. I'm not a feel guy or an emotion guy. And so what I often do is I devalue somebody's emotions because I overvalue a certain way to think. And this happens all the time, and not just in my marriage, and relationships around me, where I'll say, well, if you think about it this way, you don't feel that way. And so, or you shouldn't feel that way about this thing. And what I'm doing is I'm not validating the real emotion. The reality is that people feel emotions, whether they like it or not. And sometimes it's because they're choosing to think a certain way, but a lot of times it's something that happens to them. It's almost like a natural reaction to things. And if you devalue their emotions, then sometimes people feel devalued. So validate people's emotions, and at least they may not be right about this situation, but at least validate the way they feel about it. I think you'll understand a lot. So that was the first 8 tips. We're going to go to a next set of 8. Here we go. Tip number 9, acknowledge the difficulty. Sometimes, guys, when I'm just saying something to somebody, I just want them to understand the difficulty. I may not be right about it. I may be whining, complaining. I may be over dramatizing it. I may be making it bigger than it is. But sometimes I just need you to acknowledge that it's difficult. And what I don't need sometimes is for you to go, well, there's poor kids in Africa who are starving. That's helpful sometimes for me to have that perspective. But sometimes I just need you to know that you understand that this is a challenge. It's a unique and specific challenge, and it is difficult. Don't just say, oh, it's easy, just do this. It's easy, just do that. Sometimes it's not. So acknowledge the difficulty. That's number 9. Number 10, self-soothe if you're feeling negative emotions. Don't expect the other person to soothe your emotions. It'd be great if they could, but you need to be responsible for self-soothing. Don't put that responsibility on somebody else, because they may not be capable of doing it or may not want to do it, and you will be left feeling all the negative emotion, and that will build. So teach yourself tricks to self-soothe those negative emotions in order to find unity with other people. Number 10, use exploratory statements and open-ended questions. Instead of yes or no questions, use exploratory statements and open-ended questions so that you really do feel like you're trying to probe and understand and giving somebody free space to speak. Number 11, don't ask why. Now that one caught me off guard a little bit. I thought, why not ask why? I ask why all the time because I want to know why. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to know why. But oftentimes what why communicates to somebody is that you don't believe them, or that you don't trust their feeling or their idea or their thought. And so it turns into a defensive thing. People often get defensive when they're asked why, because they feel like you're asking them to justify themselves and that you're not trusting them. And so be careful when and where you use why. The next pro tip, bear witness to their emotion. We actually talked about this even earlier. Validate emotion, bear witness to the emotion. So don't just validate it, but actually say, I see it, I understand it. I bear witness to the emotion, and I get it, and it's okay. Next pro tip, use the other party's metaphors. I struggle with this because I try to say things in my own language because that's what I'm comfortable with, or that's what I make sense of. But it's actually really helpful for me in conversations with other people to try to use their language and use their metaphors and try to understand from their cultural perspective what they're trying to say, instead of trying to filter it through my own metaphors and my own language. So use somebody else's metaphors rather than just using your own. Tip number 15, don't take it personally. I know you can just say that, but the reality is, if you can understand that somebody's hurt and pain and frustration, maybe towards you, maybe towards something in general, isn't personal towards you, you can actually navigate through those feelings better, and you can reach unity with that person quicker. So don't take it personally, even though it might be personally. It'll help you in moving towards somebody in unity. And the last and final tip number 16, don't minimize feeling or conflict. Man, like I said before, I do this all the time. I minimize feeling and conflict all the time. I kind of say, you shouldn't be that mad about that. That's not a big deal. Or why are you blowing up about that? Who cares? Or, hey, if you think about it this way, you'll feel differently about it. I do that all the time. And if you know me, you've probably experienced that from me. But the pro tip here about unity and moving towards one another in our relationships is don't minimize feeling or conflict. The thing you might have to say is true. The idea that you have about it might be true. There might be a healthier, better, broader, more Christ-centered perspective to have. But if you start minimizing the feeling and the conflict, then people will feel shut off and shut down. And so don't minimize the feeling or the conflict, regardless of how you feel about it, so that people actually can feel heard and you can move towards unity together. So there you have it. 16 pro tips. You can go back and watch this over again if you need to write them down. They're things you know. They're things you've heard before, but they're things that we need to be reminded of in order to have unity with others, in order to turn towards one another's in humility and take initiative to seek unity together. Thanks for joining us on this week's episode of the podcast, and I hope that you guys have a great week.